Most of my shoots look something like this. Outside, on the trail, bright and early in the morning. It's fast-paced and unpredictable and usually requires a bit of hiking. And so the gear I carry and the way I work with it has to be tailored to this specific environment. One of the most noticeable ways that I've adapted my workflow to fit this outdoor run and gun shooting style is by shooting absolutely everything handheld. No gimbals or stabilizers, just a camera, a lens, and these hands. So in this video, I want to share a bunch of tips, techniques, and secrets for getting great smooth footage completely handheld. So let's jump right on into those camera settings and first talk about shooting in slow motion. Shooting at a higher frame rate like 120, 60, or even just 30 frames a second, and then slowing your footage back down to 24 in post will make a huge difference, smoothing out most of those little jitters and making them much less noticeable. So when I'm shooting a subject that doesn't have much noticeable motion in the frame, I'll shoot that subject at 60 frames per second and then slow that footage down to 40% speed when I'm editing, and that goes a really long way to make that camera motion way smoother. And when I'm shooting a subject that does have some noticeable motion to it, like a car driving or a person walking through the frame, then I'll shoot that subject at 30 frames a second and slow that footage down to 80% speed when I'm editing. And this is enough of that slow motion effect to smooth out the bumps and jitters in the motion, but not enough to make the motion like unbearably slow. You barely even notice the difference from 24 to 30. Next, let's talk about image stabilization, and there are 3 different types of this that you should be aware of. The first of which is IBIS, or in-body image stabilization. This is where your camera moves the sensor around to compensate for different bumps and jitters when you move the camera. Not every camera includes this feature, but if you're using a newer camera like the Sony A7S III, the Canon R5, or the Lumix S5 that I'm shooting this video on right now, then you will have this feature at your disposal, and it can make a huge difference for your handheld footage. The only situation where I would recommend turning this off is if you're shooting with an ultra wide lens, like a 14, 16 to 35, or even like a 20 or 24 millimeter lens, just because in-body stabilization, that movement of the sensor combined with a super wide frame, will usually result in some weird wobbly edges around the frame. While we're on the topic of deciding which lens to use, different lenses can also have stabilization built into them, which is called OIS, or optical image stabilization. This is also very effective for handheld shooting and will not give you those wobbly edges on a wide angle lens. So if you have this option on the lens you're using, there's pretty much no reason not to use it. I use Sigma lenses for everything I shoot, but sometimes I really do wish that I was using native Panasonic glass, just because most of it has really good optical image stabilization. And finally, let's talk about digital stabilization, where your camera uses software to stabilize the clip without actually moving anything around within the camera or the lens. And this is not quite as effective as the other two and can usually result in a little bit of a crop, usually around 5 or 10%, but I would say it's pretty much always worth using, yet again, just to get it a little smoother, and that 5 or 10% crop is never really that noticeable in my own experience. So those are the 3 different stabilization methods to look into, and this is really going to vary once again from setup to setup depending on the camera and lenses that you're using. So do some research, look into what you have at your disposal, and decide how to use it. But that being said, let's move on from camera settings now and talk a bit about some different methods and techniques you can use when you're shooting to get some more stable footage. First of which is super simple, and it's just to keep the motion away from the camera. The concept here is that the further away a shake or vibration is from the camera, the less of an effect it will have on the camera and the footage. So this is why that fig rig that you probably saw a few years ago actually works, because it gets your hands, and as a result, any motion that they may add to the shot, further away from the camera. So to apply this to just basic handheld shooting, you want any motion that you're adding into the shot, be it a push in or a side to side motion, a tilt or a pan, you want to get that away from the camera. Your hands and arms should be completely locked off, because they're the closest to the camera, so any motion from them is going to really show up in the footage. Instead, any camera motion you go for should be coming from your core and your legs. So if you feel like you're in the middle of a yoga class, you're probably on the right track. You're gonna look completely ridiculous, but that's okay because your footage is gonna look really good. Don't skip leg day, engage the core, and you should be on the right track. So let's move on and talk about adding a third point of contact to the camera. Having another spot where the camera kind of rests up against you in addition to just both of your hands will help to make its motion more steady. So this is why a shoulder rig works, right? It adds your shoulder as a third point of contact to the camera. For me, this usually means shooting through my camera's viewfinder, so I get that third point of contact against my eye. But another popular technique is using your camera strap to create some tension against the back of your neck and add a third point of contact there. It's also helpful to shoot with a wider focal length when possible. So if you're shooting at 20 millimeters, you can get a stable handheld shot pretty easily, but if you're shooting at 200 millimeters, it's a different story. So the further you zoom in, the more you're going to see any little bump or jitter appear in the footage. And finally, a composition technique that I use all the time for shooting handheld is to get nice and close to the subject and get some foreground in the shot, some stuff really close to the lens. Because you have subject matter so close to the camera, you don't have to move it as much to have noticeable motion in the shot. So you might be able to get away with just leaning forward to get a push in rather than having to walk forward and introduce way more camera motion and shake into the clip. And I realize those last couple techniques, using a certain lens or framing your shot a certain way, can be a little restrictive depending on what you want to shoot. Which brings me to my final piece of advice, which is just to know your limits. Basically, don't bite off more than you can chew. There are some shots you can get using a gimbal that you just can't really replicate when shooting handheld, at least not replicate with good results. But at the same time, there are shots that work way better when you're shooting handheld. You can get closer to the subject and have a more organic motion. So rather than trying and most likely failing to be a gimbal, get creative to make the most of what you have at your disposal. And that's a mindset that can be applied to way more under the umbrella of filmmaking than just how you hold a camera. All that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video or learned something new from it. If you did and you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to Adorama TV and also check out the playlist of all of the videos we've done together, including the previous video before this one, which is a more general overview of camera motion, not just specifically handheld camera motion. And if that's still somehow not enough content for you, then you can also consider subscribing to my channel. But maybe don't tell anyone you heard that from me. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.